Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Ancient Maya, and we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more and you start to get into kind of the complexities of these very important peoples, that you kind of center in on these as a way to get yourself started. So let's get into it. The first term for us is simply periodization. All right. So when we're talking kind of pre-Columbian communities and peoples and cultures and archaeology and architecture and sort of all of these and social views and gender roles and everything, oftentimes archaeologists and historians and others throughout the sort of long arc of history, both in the US if they're studying the Maya and in other areas, they have tended to engage in sort of a periodization where they study kind of the effects or the contributions or the society from one time to kind of to another. And they usually quabble over when one of those times begin and one of those times sort of ends and all that stuff. So generally, when it comes to thinking about kind of the Maya from the 1500s and before, they usually have around 3 different periods. And the first is what's called kind of the pre-classical period. The second is called the classical period. This is the time period where you've got really a flowering of culture where, part of that is that we've got a lot of physical evidence of what's going on there. So it tells us a lot when it comes to the Maya. And then the third is kind of the post-classical. So that brings us then to our second point, which is pre-classical. So when we're talking pre-classical Mayan civilizations, we're really talking about the time period from around 2000 BCE or so up until about 250 CE. So we're talking about 1800 years of history, although some archaeologists and other scholars look past that and before that as a way to kind of predate what they see as kind of starting to develop around 2000. And there are some scholars that look at the pre-classical period as sort of ending just a little after 250, but generally about 2000 to about 250. This is the time period in which, for many of the Maya, they're actively engaged in a number of forms of kind of Mesoamerican kind of cultural formation, because when we're talking about the Maya, we're talking about their place and presence in a number of modern Latin American nations, right? So parts of modern Mexico and Guatemala and Belize, right? Sort of that kind of thing. We're also talking about kind of the period in which you're going to start to see the formations of a number of Mayan cities that are starting to grow here. So certainly El Mirador and others, would be good examples of this. I know that Chichen Itza later is, of course, the big one that everybody sort of likes to emphasize. This brings us to our third term. So our third term is just kind of classical. So when we're talking about kind of classical ancient Maya, early Maya civilization, really what we're talking about here is a period from about 250-ish or so CE up into about 950-ish or so CE. This is really kind of the time period in which populations are starting to grow, right? Labor practices are having a big effect on this. Demographics are changing. This is a time period in which you're going to start to see kind of the formation of a number of city-states where they have these very intricate sort of political networks kind of back and forth. This is a time period in which you've got a lot of public art and monuments and displays and culture. This is also a time period in which some other fairly, maybe more known cities for some of us are going to start to form, and in some cases have kind of clashes or vying for power between one another. So this is, of course, if I'm thinking about Teotihuacan, thinking about Tikal, right, and others. Eventually, right, this classical Mayan civilization is going to struggle, right? So by the time you get into the 9th, into the 10th centuries and that, right, there's a number of sort of contributing factors as to why some of these cities start to have difficulties. Certainly agriculture and irrigation and a number of other things, warfare, etc. And this kind of brings us to our fourth point, which is post-classic or post-classical. So historians kind of looking at, and archaeologists looking at kind of the post-classical Mayan period, they're looking around sort of 950-ish, and they're going to take that all the way up to the early 1500s, to the period of kind of the conquest of the Americas. Now, some of the things that they're going to look at is, how or why did sort of this classical Mayan civilization, these communities collapse? One of them was sort of the ruling structures, right? That the ruling structures of the classical period kind of collapsed, right? That was a big deal. Migration was a serious cause as well, and depending on which community we're talking about, kind of endemic warfare was also something that was a contributing factor. There are some cities here that are quite noteworthy. Certainly, the importance of Mayapan cannot be understated here during this time. And this kind of brings us into then our fifth term, right? So you have these kind of separate Mayan communities, and the fifth term for us is one of those. It's Nopaten. Now, Nopaten was a Mayan community that it has a fairly interesting history in that it is really kind of the last independent Mayan community to be attacked by the Spanish, to be taken by the Spanish. But this is something that takes quite a long time to occur. So many historians, the last few years, last few decades, have been trying to kind of rewrite that, indigenous as victim entirely, kind of understanding of the conquest of the Americas, where that for many of them, kind of what they're writing about now is the idea that no. Indigenous peoples really across the Americas fought back hard for a long time, right, against Spanish presence and Portuguese and others, and certainly up, if we're talking up north, right, against the English and that kind of thing, and the French. From the early 1500s, for example, right, you've got all of the different communities that would make up the Incan world, right, are going to fight back against Francisco Pizarro and his folks. And that's something that you still have communities resisting. They started in the 1530s. The resistance is going through the 1570s and 80s. Nopaten, and I know my pronunciation is terrible, sorry about that, but Nopaten, 1697, right, 1697. So this last independent Mayan community is not taken by the Spanish until 1697. All right, thank you so very much.